Good afternoon, everyone. We are going to take a journey of sacred sound, and we're going to look at how sound works in sacred ways through a number of caves, caverns, chambers, and churches. So sacred sound is one of the hidden dimensions of sacred space. And so we will be journeying to different places of power to explore how sound and music activates these environments. Before we begin, we will do a short musical meditation. So I invite you to sit in whatever way is comfortable to you and to close your eyes and to take 3 deep, neutral breaths. And as you hear and feel the vibration of the chant, feel it resonating through your psychic centers, through your solar plexus, your adrenals, your heart, your thymus gland, your thyroid, your pituitary gland, and pineal gland. And let it penetrate your being as we go deep inside ourselves. And let the sound fill your inner chambers and make room for the silence and the sacred sound. Sacred sound is used to connect heaven and earth through the conduit of humanity. As you open your eyes, imagine a landscape in front of you with the light and dark moving across the land. And you're in tune with the natural world, and you can even sense and feel the electromagnetic currents coursing through the paths and springs along the landscape. You can see and understand the movement of the stars and the planets and the moon and the other celestial bodies. And through tending to the land and the animals season after season, you're in tune with the fertility of the earth and the harshness and the beauty of the elements. You exist at the convergence of celestial and earthly forces. And it is through this framework that we enter our exploration of sound being used in sacred ways. The visionary writer, John Michel, writes that the ancient priests were responsible for the creation of sacred landscapes. And one of their primary tasks was to locate and occupy the places of highest spiritual energy on the land, and to ensure they were in relationship with the other power spots of the country and of the heavens. And these spots could be located over underground water sources or close to a ground level water source or a sacred well or close to fault lines, and most consistently located on an area of highly charged earth energy, what we might even call ley lines. And they might also be called dragon lines or spirit lines in some traditions. As the spiritual work of ritual and singing and chanting and toning took place at these sites, it would be amplified by the earth's energies, and it would be carried across and into the land. And this is the art that he describes as enchanting the landscape. Sacred sites serve as generators of order and harmony. And in some cultures, there are even myths of perpetual choirs that would constantly chant to maintain the sacred order of the land. And with a little sound interference, sound traveled far across the land. And this image is a painting by William Blake called Ancient of Days. And it's a representation of the creator figure, a depiction of the Godhead imparting cosmic order to earth with his heavenly compass of gold. If we go back in time, when the world was much quieter, sound played an incredibly important role for people. In the French Pyrenees, there are a number of caves that exhibit very unique paintings, and many of you are probably well familiar with a number of these caves and the paintings, but there's also evidence of ritual use of sound in these caves. Acoustical researchers have undertaken work to understand how sound was used, and they've looked for areas where there's an intersection of man-made artifact and strong resonance inside of the cave. And they found that at the Nio and La Portelle cave systems, that 80 to 90% of the paintings were found in areas where the sound resonance was the strongest. Now, the most well-known cave is that of Lascaux. And this image right here is from a part of the cave called the Hall of the Bulls. And Lascaux was discovered in 1940, but these paintings date back to around 17 to 19,000 years ago. And in the Hall of the Bulls, there are evenly spaced and balanced rock paintings of large bulls, and the sound produced in these areas were deep, long-lasting sounds coming from all directions. In another area called the Nave, there are paintings of two back-to-back mirror image bison. And here the researchers found that the echoes were stereophonically identical in each direction. And their conclusion was that something ritually significant was taking place at the areas where you have the intersection of image and sound. And that sound could have been toning or chanting or percussive, but even more elementally, they experienced the echoes of the sound around and throughout the cave. And one of the theories is that they were engaged in forms of spirit communication through the echoes. And in some places in the cave, the sound echoes very loudly, and in some places it's completely silent. And so they would hear disembodied sounds of creatures that they couldn't see. And there are a number of oral effects of the resonance leading to the conclusion that the cave could then be alive, potentially with unseen forces. Another important factor here is that of light. And it must have taken an immense amount of light and of fire to have provided the environment to create these paintings. Because without light in a cave, you're lost and you may never find your way out. And that's another reason why sound was so important in these locations. Now, this is another cave, a different cave, but imagine not having light and then bringing light and fire into a cave and encountering a forest of stalactites and stalagmites. And in some caves, archaeologists have found marks on the stalactites and stalagmites where they were struck repeatedly. And the theory is that they were creating different bell sounds with the minerals. And today we have crystal bowls, and those are made from quartz and other minerals. But back in these caves, these were calcite formations. And so these were also potentially used as instruments. Now we go to a different part of the world, and this site will be familiar to those of you who are calling in from the UK. This is an area called Wayland Smithy, and it's the home of the legendary home of Wayland, the Saxon god of metalworking, thus the name Smithy. And in this location, two researchers, Paul Devereaux and Robert Jan, decided to investigate the acoustics. And Paul Devereaux is a researcher of sacred sites and ley lines and stone circles. And Robert Jan ran a special lab at Princeton University, and it was a lab where they studied different parapsychology topics. And so together they found that the spaces were tuned, that this space was tuned to a resonance frequency of 110 hertz. Now, that's the sound of a low baritone male voice, so it's in the lower human range. And I will play for you what that sounds like. I will show you rather what that sounds like. So here on the keyboard, 110 hertz is over here, and this is what we call a low A on the keyboard. So in certain areas, they found that the intensity of the sound increased. And this is because of a phenomenon known as standing waves. And what happens with standing waves is at certain frequencies, the sound bounces off the walls and then it comes back and amplifies and intensifies the original sound. And this leads to a much more intense, louder sound. And so this, in many places, this sound, this resonance would only occur at 110 hertz. So we would call 110 hertz that low A, the resonant frequency of that space. And what's interesting about this is that during the course of their research, they did some psychology experiments with participants on the effects of the 110 hertz frequency. And they found that they had changes in their brain state. And so the right hemisphere became extremely activated, and those participants experienced shifts of consciousness into trance states. Now, as we move along, we will move to another landmark, Newgrange, which is in present-day Ireland. And Newgrange is dated to around 3000 BCE. And Newgrange is what archaeologists call a passage tomb, and it's known for its activity at sunrise on winter solstice. So if you can imagine the darkness of winter and picture the sunrise on the shortest day of the year, with the air filled with the quiet and stillness that comes at dawn. And on that day, the sun shines directly into this shaft. You can see this plan view, you see the little cruciform shaft there. That is what's represented in the drawing here on the right side, where you see the illustration with the stones and the roof that's been corbelled into the landscape. And so we know this about light and alignment to celestial events, but what do we know about sound at this site? So the same researchers found that Newgrange also has the resonant frequency of 110 hertz. And they were able to see that the space had been modified to resonate at this frequency. So a number of the stones that you see here in this illustration up toward the ceilings, those have been placed in areas that weren't related to the structural integrity of the space. So they determined that the builders were acting to purposely sculpt the sound. And also the sounds in the clay there are not native to that area. So there's a very deliberate selection of materials. Now, with the light coming in at winter solstice, they believe that there was also a sound component. Now, the cavern is of artificial construction. It's built deep within the earth, and it seems like it's designed to accumulate energy. So you have the light and the celestial energy accentuated by sound, and then the light and sound traveling from the entrance toward the center. This is about a 62-foot passage. So what really happened here is a mystery, but we do have some small clues to the mystery, because you all can see this symbol here on the wall on the photograph to the right side. You have this triple spiral there. That is called a triskel. And for us, we're used to seeing this. It's common in a number of places now, but Newgrange was one of the places where this was first identified. And during their acoustical research at Newgrange, they developed the theory that this triskel shape is actually from what we call cymatics. So they developed a theory that it's from a cymatic pattern. And cymatics are basically visible patterns created by sound when it's acted on in a material, say such as smoke or sand. So if you can imagine being in this chamber and imagining the light and the wind and the dust and perhaps the incense smoke moving all together within the space, and then you add sound. And under certain conditions and certain frequencies, the shapes of the sound waves become visible as they move through the space, thus creating the form of the triskel. And so Robert Jahn, in his laboratory at Princeton, set out to recreate the conditions that would result in the visible sound patterns being produced. And he was able to create them, to recreate them, leading them to put forth this theory about the triskel. And when we look at dowsing and dowsers measuring beneficial energies, this symbol gives a very high life-giving energetic vibration. And at this site, Devereaux also discusses how sound is perceived as a magical force, and that how it helps pierce through the shaft. And in some areas it's loud, in some areas it's quiet. And so it plays hide and seek within this long resonating chamber, similar to how we were before talking about with sound in the caves. Now we move on to the Great Pyramid, and we'll talk about sound in the King's Chamber and the sarcophagus. So it's almost like this masterpiece of the Great Pyramid was built in one way to be a giant resonance chamber. And it operates on many different levels and allows connections with different dimensions and states of consciousness. And in some pyramid literature, there is mention of the pyramid itself periodically making deep resonating sounds. Now in the king's chamber, the surfaces are of polished granite, and this makes this an amazing place for resonance. Now, if you've ever been in the king's chamber, you probably remember that it's very difficult to speak in there because consonants and speech, with all the resonance in the chamber, your voice echoes back at you. But if you are toning or chanting, it's very easy. It's almost like the space is crafted specifically for the elongated tones of vowels. In Aristotle's Poetics, Demetrius has a famous quote, and he said, in Egypt, when priests sing hymns to the gods, they sing the 7 vowels in due succession. And the sound of these vowels has such euphony that men listen to it instead of the flute and the lyre. And euphony simply means that it's pleasing to the ear. And so when chanting or intoning with the resonance, the sound gets added to itself. And this opens up another dimension through which to bring oneself into resonance and harmony with the space. So the sound becomes, in a way, for us, it adds to our ability to actively participate in the sacred order. So a number of you are probably familiar with the Rosicrucian recording of Ed Lee performing vowel sounds in the Great Pyramid. And it begins with an incredibly resonant instrument being struck 3 times. This is the sound of the sarcophagus. When the sarcophagus is struck, it calls the consciousness to attention. So based on our previous conversation, you're probably thinking, well, what frequency is that? Well, earlier we discussed the consciousness altering tone of 110 hertz and how that's engineered into many sacred spaces. And when we listen to this sarcophagus being struck, the fundamental tone that comes across is almost 220 hertz, which is a multiple of 110. So 220 hertz right here on the piano keyboard is an octave higher than the 110. So that would be the middle A, and it sounds like this. So the sarcophagus itself is slightly lower tuned than that. And right here, you can see this note right next to middle A, that's A flat. And that's the tone that you actually hear when you listen to the recording of the sarcophagus being struck. But I have a theory about that. And that is that, here we'll go back to this picture, that when you take into account this damage here on the corner, that has changed the frequency of it. And so my theory is that if that damage wasn't there, that it would be struck with that frequency. When you hit it, that you would hear 220. So it would be right on that middle A tone. And another thing that's really cool about this is that when we have that middle A, as many of you know, that's one of the most important notes on which we intone some of the most important Rosicrucian vowel sounds. So the sarcophagus seems like it's made to resonate at this very specific frequency for very sacred purposes. Now, one other thing before we leave our topic of the Great Pyramid. So earlier from Newgrange, we talked about the cymatics. And also here at the Great Pyramid, another acoustic researcher has done work and research on the sarcophagus also. So John Stuart Reid performed experiments in the King's Chamber focused on how the resonance in the chamber affected the vibrations inside the granite sarcophagus. And they found some fascinating results. And so you can see here that the sarcophagus has this damage on the corner. To conduct the experiment, they constructed a temporary correction to that corner. And then they took a thin film of plastic and stretched it across the top. And then they hung little sandbags around to make sure it was evenly spaced and evenly across the top of the sarcophagus. And then they took a speaker and put it inside the sarcophagus and had a tone generator outside. And they were trying to simulate the creation of vowel sounds. And they found that at certain frequencies, the shapes that were created resembled hieroglyphs. And so if you look at these photographs right above, these are some examples of some of the shapes that came out of their research. So one is very similar to the Jed pillar, which is very important in Egyptian biogeometry, but also Egyptian sacred geometry. And then also the Eye of Horus, which most of us are familiar with, also in terms of Egyptian history and sacred history. Okay, so now we move to another part of the world and we go to Stonehenge. And Stonehenge presents another interesting example of how sound was used at sacred megalithic sites. And at Stonehenge, there are two researchers, Aaron Watson and David Keating, who looked at how the stones were sculpted for sound transmission. And they found that the tallest inner stones were concave and polished in contrast to their opposite sides. And they determined that sound was being channeled towards the people in the center of the monument, and then out of the line of hearing of those that weren't supposed to hear. So the stone circle sculpted sound to keep it inside. And they said that, for instance, an audience occupying the confined interior would have heard amplified sound, and this was especially effective for voices. And that fieldwork also revealed that the size and the close spacing of the sarsen stones allowed resonance to form. And the sarsen stones is a name given to the large blocks of sandstone found in the area. Now, another interesting component of Stonehenge is that it's a landscape temple. And the writer Freddie Silva talks about how temples are invisible worlds of harmonics, resonance, and subtle energies, and that the sacred geometry reflects the perfection of nature. And the architects encoded nature's harmonics in the design of the sites. So the arrangements of the elements inside the temples are based on natural laws, and their dimensions and their harmonics interact with our bodies and subconscious. And that certain geometries were used for certain disciplines and certain effects. So using the example above, when we look at Stonehenge, he writes about how, depending on what the intent is of the inhabitants, that different geometries are activated in the circle. So if they wanted to focus on healing, for instance, then the geometry and energy of the pentagram was used. Only the parts of Stonehenge that are defined by the pentagram would be activated. So if they were working with sound, then they would invoke the geometry associated with sound, the seven-sided heptagram. And then that would bring the entire site online. So the geometry affects the body, and then the body goes into resonance with the site. Now, at Stonehenge, the avenue, which is indicated by this red line going through the illustration, reflects different conditions at different times of year. So at the summer solstice, the sun rises along one side, and you can see that at the top right corner, and that rises over there by what's called the heel stone. And then on the winter solstice, it rises along on the other side. And so we know that it's aligned to the light and the sun. And we can see the connection of these prehistoric alignments to celestial phenomena. And another thing about these sites is that you can often feel the tingle of the Earth's electromagnetic energy currents. So that feeling that we have with all the energy rushing through our bodies after we, for instance, charge our bodies with the all over exercise or after positive breathing. So the hidden dimension here is how other factors used along with sound can help to shape the experience and allow the inhabitants to participate in the sacred activity. And we're reminded of the idea of ritual and singing and chanting and toning taking place at these sites, and the intentional human created sound and how that helps to connect the celestial energies with the earth energies and helps to carry this life-giving force across and into the land. And here also, sound helps to activate the sacred experience and can result in changes of the consciousness of the inhabitants and the site. So from here, we will go look at a cathedral, Wells Cathedral. And this is also in England. And it's built very specifically with the human voice in mind. And that is to accentuate and amplify it. And these spaces come alive when they are sung in. And you can tell by the quality of light and the lightness of the structure and the height of the architecture that we can sense the elevation of the spirit and that sacred connection. And so in these spaces, the voice can be used to create life and elevate our consciousness and help us remember our connection to divinity. And it creates a connection between the heavens and the earth, and between people and the form and the material. And combined with the sacred geometry and the materials and the stone and the light, the voice can be the agent that activates or brings alive the energy and intent and the prima materia of the building. And the sound of a beautiful human voice while singing or toning or chanting elicits a deep emotional response that is unmatched by any other instrument. So this cathedral was built in the 12th and 13th century, and it's a Gothic cathedral, and it's built on top of two sacred wells known for their healing properties. And in talking about cathedrals in general, John Michel, the writer, says that the Christian geomancers whose hidden influence during the Middle Ages cited and built their miraculous structures to serve as instruments for the accumulation and fusion of energy and for its dissemination to the benefit of the locality and of the pilgrims who visited. And I think even beyond that, that these spaces help to provide that light to the whole world. It's not just that one locality, but it gets magnified and magnified with all the different sacred spaces that we have. So in these photographs, this space called the chapter house is on the left. And this was a space primarily created for meeting. But then there's also some singing in this space, and it has a very specific resonant frequency inside that space. So some tones sound better than others. And in the nave of the cathedral, you can almost imagine hearing chants and singing filling the space and allowing the inhabitants to deeply feel that connection between themselves and the heavenly realms. Okay, and so now we'll look at a couple of other churches in England. So many churches were built to emphasize harmonics of the voice. And you can see this captured in a number of the churches built by the Templars throughout Europe. And they were masters of citing, geometry, and just in general, the art of creating buildings with harmony that are designed to invoke this connection with the divine. So one example of this is this church. It's the Church of St. Michael de la Roupe, and it's in Brentor, and it's dedicated to the Archangel Michael. And in this church, the design of the lower ceilings and the geometry accentuate the lower register of the male singing voice. And these churches were generally, well, this church, but many churches were dedicated to saintly figures of the church. And so these are Christian overlay names, but even before the churches were built, the ground was considered to be sacred for the community. And in pre-Christian times, these sites were known to the local inhabitants as places of power. So some were places with sacred wells that had healing qualities like we had just spoken about before. And at times they knew what hills had special power at certain times of year, and that stones on the site had certain qualities that could be emphasized and used. And we also see a dedication of this site to the divine masculine. And so this church sits at the intersection of two of the most potent energy lines or ley lines going through England, through the south of England. And those two lines are called the St. Michael line, and then there's also the St. Mary line. And those two lines, as they go through southern England, they intersect at different places. And where you have those intersections, you have places of especially potent energy, so huge power spots. And this church is located on one of those. It's sited on one of those intersections. Now, when you look at the landscape in Feng Shui, the Chinese would designate this landscape as being masculine, yang, because its form is very steep and craggy. This next chapel is St. Catherine's Chapel, and it celebrates the divine feminine. This chapel is dedicated to St. Catherine of Alexandria, who was martyred in the 3rd century. And this is a depiction of her at the bottom in this Caravaggio painting. And in this church, there are high ceilings, and the high geometry emphasizes the higher register of the female singing voice. And this church happens to be on an energy alignment called the St. Catherine's line. And for our final 2 slides, we go to more recent history. And in recent history, looking at the voice allows us to create, we've looked at how the voice has allowed us to create sacred space around us. But here, I'm highlighting Negro spirituals, because these have helped people create sacred space regardless of the environment. And it's a very good example of how using the voice to create that space has allowed for physical and the social landscape around us to change. In the African American Christian tradition, enslaved people created a new musical style, rightly called spirituals. And these were work songs sung in the fields and in the house. And they're created by groups of people to uplift the spirit, to unite people under the cause of liberation of body and soul. And these were Bible stories set to music and retold through oral transmission. So they were constantly changing. And they were told through word of mouth because it was illegal for them to read and write. And so spirituals are a way of displaying faith and seeking liberty, hope, and salvation and freedom. This particular spiritual that we'll listen to is called Rockin' Jerusalem, and it speaks to the coming of a new age of divine intervention and order on earth as archangels bring about the new Jerusalem. And this is related to the vision given to John in the book of Revelation.
Rockin' Jerusalem, church getting higher, ringing them bells. Church getting higher, rockin' Jerusalem, church getting higher, ringing them bells. Oh Mary, oh Martha, oh Mary, ring them bells. Oh Mary, oh Martha, oh Mary, ring them bells. Jerusalem, 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 oh, ringing them bells. Jerusalem, 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 oh, ringing them bells. New Jerusalem, rocking Jerusalem, New Jerusalem, ringing them bells, rocking Jerusalem. Ringing them bells, oh Mary, oh Martha, oh Mary, ring them bells, oh Mary, oh Martha, oh Mary, ring them bells. Jerusalem, 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 oh, ringing them bells. Jerusalem, 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 oh, ringing them.
So we've come to the end of our journey, and we begin our journey in the darkness underneath the earth, and we've traveled through caverns across the land. We've explored sound as it could have interacted with the rising sun and the changing of seasons. And we've heard the voice soar in chambers and churches and cathedrals and across the land. And we've experienced the power of the song to embolden a sacred resilience in humanity. So we end coming back full circle with an ensemble singing a chant. They're enchanting a seemingly mundane landscape. It's a church parking garage and making it into a much better sacred space. So the next time you're in a sacred space or in a space you would like to make sacred or more sacred, I encourage you to engage with the space through sound and allow yourself to bring this expanded dimension to your sacred work. So we will end with another musical meditation, listening to this chant by Hildegard von Bingen. And I invite you once again to close your eyes and take 3 deep breaths, neutral breaths. And as we listen to this chant, to go deep inside and feel your connection strengthen with your divinity and with all of our fratres and sorors. So that concludes our presentation